The Gilded Cage, the true story of the Triangle Factory fire. Imagine a cold night, the kind that bites through your coat, but the air inside is thick, hot, and humming with the frantic energy of 1,000 sewing machines. Now, imagine something else. The year is 1911. You're a young woman, maybe an Italian immigrant named Rosaria, or a Russian Jewish refugee called Fanny. You're 16, working on the 9th floor of a Manhattan skyscraper, the Ash Building, a fortress of steel and concrete for $7 a week. You're stitching collars for the Triangle Shirtwaist Company. You've heard the rumors. You know the doors are kept locked from the outside while you work to prevent theft, the foreman says. But you know the truth. It's to keep you chained to your machine until the last whistle blows. Then, at 4:40 p.m. on March 25th, the impossible happens. A discarded cigarette, a spark, a pile of cotton scraps under a cutting table. In the next 18 minutes, 146 people, mostly young immigrant women like you, will die. This isn't just a story about a tragedy. It's the story of the American dream turning into a waking nightmare. It's the origin story of every safety regulation, every fire code, every worker's right you take for granted today. It's the moment when America looked at its factory system and realized the cost of cheap clothes was human life. Chapter 1. The Fabric of Dreams and Dust. New York City, 1909. They called it Klein Deutschland and Little Italy, and the Lower East Side Ghetto. To the financiers uptown, it was a pestilence of noise and poverty. To the people who lived there, huddled 10 to a room in rattling tenements with fire escapes like rusted spider webs, it was simply New York. And it was the only chance they had. Italians from the sun-drenched Mezzogiorno crossed paths with Jews fleeing the Tsar's pogroms. They spoke a dozen languages, but they all understood one word: work. And the work, the brutal, endless work that fueled the burgeoning American ready-to-wear garment industry, was waiting for them, floors high in the massive modern Ash Building on the corner of Washington Place and Green Street. It was here, on the 8th, 9th, and 10th floors, that the Triangle Shirtwaist Company spun gold from cotton and silk. The owners, Max Blanc and Isaac Harris, known wryly in the neighborhood as the Shirtwaist Kings, had the kind of story America loved. They were Jewish immigrants themselves who'd built a powerhouse business through sheer grit and ruthless efficiency. They employed about 500 people, churning out the Gibson Girls uniform, the stylish, high-collared blouse known as the shirtwaist. And at the center of this human machine was a vibrant young woman named Clara Lemlich. Clara was a firebrand, all 5 feet of her. She'd come from Ukraine, her small body carrying the weight of ancient injustice and a very modern, very American indignation. She wasn't just a seamstress, she was an organizer. She saw the women around her, hands raw from the work, lungs full of cotton dust, and her blood boiled. 10 hours a day, 6 days a week, 72 cents for 144 pockets. Fines deducted from their meager pay for humming, for a crooked seam, for using the wrong thread. They had to supply their own needles and thread, for God's sakes. "We are not just cogs in a machine," she would hiss to her friends, her Yiddish peppered with fiery, newly learned English. "We are the ones who make the fabric, and they treat us like dust." In November 1909, this dust exploded. A citywide strike of shirtwaist makers was brewing, but the leaders of the International Ladies Garment Workers Union, ILGWI, were cautious. A general strike was dangerous, costly, and likely to fail. They were ready to accept a small compromise. But Clara was not. In a massive rally at Cooper Union Hall, listening to the men debate timidly about a small, polite action, Clara could take it no longer. She marched through the crowd, pushed her way onto the stage, and silenced the cautious speakers. In Yiddish, her voice cracking with fury and determination, she declared, "I have listened to all the speakers, and I have no further patience for talk. I am a working girl, one of those who are on strike. I move that we go on a general strike." The crowd of thousands, mostly young women, erupted. They didn't vote, they roared. They didn't just agree, they swore an ancient Jewish oath. "If I turn traitor to the cause, then let my hand wither from the arm I raised." This strike, known forever after as the Uprising of the 20,000, lasted 13 grueling weeks through the freezing New York winter. Clara Lemlich was beaten by the owner's hired thugs, her ribs cracked, yet she refused to back down, returning to the picket line from her hospital bed. In the end, many small shops gave in, but the Triangle Shirtwaist Company stood firm. Blanc and Harris refused to sign a union contract, refused to grant better pay or safer conditions. They simply waited out the strike, hired scabs, and kept their profits safe. To Blanc and Harris, the greatest threat wasn't a fire, it was the lock. And when the strikers finally had to return to work in 1910, beaten but not defeated, the women who came back to the Triangle floors knew one chilling thing. The locks on the doors were still there, and they were stronger than ever. The American dream was stitched onto the shirtwaist, but the nightmare was waiting in the oil-soaked scraps on the floor, ready to ignite. Chapter 2. The Ninth Floor's Delicate Threads. New York City, March 1911. The ninth floor of the Ash Building was a vast, open space, stretching nearly 10,000 square feet. Light streamed in through the tall windows facing Washington Place, cutting through the perpetual haze of cotton lint and illuminating the long, regimented rows of tables. This wasn't a casual workplace, it was a textile battery farm. The machines, hundreds of heavy iron-based sewing machines, were powered by belts dropped from whirring overhead shafts, creating a ceaseless, rhythmic thump-thump-thump that made conversation nearly impossible. The air, despite the chill outside, was hot and thick, scented with machine oil, steaming pressing irons, and the faint, sweet smell of cheap perfume trying to mask unwashed bodies. Here worked Rosaria Giammona and her mother, Catherine. They were Sicilians, new arrivals who spoke little English. They lived in a cold-water flat in the teeming Italian district just blocks away. Rosaria was 17, dark-eyed, with hands already showing the faint scarring of a year spent handling needles and shears. For Rosaria, the Triangle was not a tomb. It was a triumph. Back home, life was a grinding stone of peasant poverty. Here, she and her mother earned enough to send a little money back to the family, to buy a real hat for Sunday Mass, and to harbor the belief that their life was climbing. Every stitch was a step up the ladder, even if the building itself felt like a cage. On the other side of the massive room, near the Green Street windows, sat Fanny Rosenfeld, older than Rosaria by a few years, perhaps 22. Fanny was a landsman, a Yiddish speaker from the old country, and a veteran of the uprising of the 20,000. She hadn't just returned to the Triangle, she'd returned with a quiet, burning resentment. Fanny was one of the operators, the elite class of seamstresses who ran the machines. She was fast, meticulous, and earned the most, maybe $10 a week, enough to keep her siblings in school. But the money came with a price, constant humiliation.
The floor was policed by foremen, men like Giacomo Vianello, another Italian immigrant, who were essentially spies for Blank and Harris. They watched the workers' every move. Need to use the restroom? Raise your hand. Giacomo would stroll over, clock your time, and often make a rude, dismissive gesture. 5 minutes too long? Docked pay. Want a drink of water? The water buckets were communal, tepid, and often empty. And always, everywhere was the lint. It coated the floor, drifted into corners, and clung to the rows of cutting scraps, the rag bins under the long tables. These bins were technically supposed to be emptied twice a day, but that cost the owners time and money, so the bins overflowed, creating mountains of flammable cotton. The routine of subtraction. The owner's philosophy, Fanny knew, was simple: maximum output for minimum input. Every part of the factory was designed to squeeze a penny. The exits? There were 2 main exits on the 9th floor. One was the main freight elevator bank, which was often backed up with cloth bolts and finished garments. The other was a narrow stairwell that led down to the 8th floor. This door, the one closest to Fanny's section, was always locked. It had been locked ever since the strike. "It's to keep the union rats from sneaking in and the girls from stealing scraps," Blank had roared to a foreman. The women knew the real reason. If the door was locked, they couldn't sneak out 5 minutes early, and they couldn't take a union pamphlet on the way home. It was control, absolute and total. The fire escapes. There was a single external fire escape, a rickety, rusted ladder contraption that Blank and Harris had been forced to install by city code. It was known to be flimsy, and it ended not at the ground, but on a precarious platform on the 2nd floor, a detail the city inspectors somehow missed. Rosaria didn't dwell on the locked door. She focused on the rhythm of her work, the soothing whir of the foot pedal, and the pile of perfectly sewn collars growing beside her. She was saving up for her fiancé, Salvatore Maltese, a young waiter, to buy a suit for their wedding. The goal was concrete, the dream was clear. But Fanny dwelled on everything. She kept her union card tucked into her bodice. Every time Giacomo's heavy shadow fell across her workstation, she felt the phantom pain of the club that had cracked Clara Lemlich's ribs. On the afternoon of Friday, March 24th, 1911, the 9th floor was buzzing with a particularly frenzied energy. Payroll was coming, and they were all trying to hit their quotas. Fanny glanced down at the floor near the cutting tables. A fresh pile of chiffon, madras, and lawn scraps was spilling out of a bin, almost touching the bare gas jets used to heat the irons. She called over to the nearest cutter, a young Italian boy named Angelo. "Angelo, clean that up. It's right next to the iron." Angelo just shrugged, his eyes dead with exhaustion. "Foreman says wait. Too much work." Fatty shook her head, a familiar knot of anxiety tightening in her stomach. The safety lesson learned during the strike, that their lives were cheap, was a silent rule on the 9th floor. They were building the finest clothes in America inside what amounted to a massive, beautifully lit tinderbox. As the sun dipped below the Manhattan skyscrapers, casting long, menacing shadows across the rows of machines, Rosaria and Fanny packed their lunches, their wages tucked tight in their gloves. They said good night, one in Italian, one in Yiddish. They both had the weekend ahead, a precious 48 hours of freedom before returning to the beautiful, deadly clockwork of the Triangle Shirtwaist Company. They had no way of knowing that when the bell rang on Saturday, March 25th, 1911, it wouldn't be the end of the shift, but the end of their world.
Chapter 3. The 18 Minutes of Terror. Saturday, March 25th, 1911, 4:40 p.m. It was a beautiful, crisp Saturday afternoon. The workday was almost over. In just 20 minutes, the Triangle workers would be free to enjoy the Sabbath, their wages finally in hand.
The atmosphere on the 9th floor was electric with anticipation, the whirring machines performing their final symphony before the weekend silence. Rosaria Giamona was gathering her finished collars, eager to get home and show her mother the day's total. Fanny Rosenfeld was stretching her back, wiping the sweat from her brow, already planning the next union meeting in her head. Then, a cough, a sputtering sound from the cutting tables on the 8th floor directly below them. A foreman on the 8th floor, a man named Samuel Bernstein, noticed it first. A faint, oily smoke curling up from the scrap bins beneath the cutter's tables. A discarded cigarette, perhaps, or a stray spark from one of the faulty electrical components. It was small, contained, and fast. 4:42 p.m. The whisper of fire. Within seconds, the fire, fueled by the mountains of fine, dry cotton scraps and the oil-soaked wooden tables, was no longer a wisp of smoke, but a hungry, growing beast. It raced along the cutting tables, consuming the lightweight fabric and paper patterns like kindling. On the 8th floor, chaos erupted. Workers frantically grabbed pails of water, only to find the fire hoses were rotted and non-functional, the valves seized up from years of neglect. Some workers managed to douse the flames with what little water they had, or by throwing finished shirtwaists onto the blaze, sacrificing their work to save their lives. Crucially, the owners, Blank and Harris, and their executive staff were working on the 10th floor. They felt the vibrations, smelled the smoke, and were warned by telephone. They escaped immediately to the roof, where they were eventually rescued. But the women on the 9th floor received no direct warning. 4:45 p.m. The inferno rises. The flames found the vertical shafts in the open stairwells, roaring up from the 8th floor like a chimney. The heat on the 9th floor became instantly unbearable. The smoke was thick, black, and choked the air, plunging the massive room into a terrifying twilight. Fanny Rosenfeld was the first on the 9th floor to realize the magnitude of the danger. She screamed not in Yiddish or English, but in the universal language of pure panic. "Fire! Fire! Get out!" Hundreds of women rose from their machines, tripping over the low wooden chairs, stumbling toward the nearest exit. 4:47 p.m. The trapped cage. The rush to escape immediately bottlenecked at the two available exits. The Washington Place stairwell. This was the main route, a narrow wooden staircase. It quickly became a surging tide of human bodies. Women pushed, fell, and were trampled. This stairwell was soon engulfed in flames rising from below. The Green Street exit, the locked door. This door, the one Fanny had warned about, led to a second, internal stairwell. A crush of women, including Rosaria and her mother, reached it first. They yanked, shoved, and beat on the reinforced wood and steel. It was locked. Foreman Giacomo Vianello, who held the key, was nowhere to be found. He had probably already escaped down the burning main stairwell. The key to freedom was gone, and the women realized in a single heart-stopping moment that they were not just in a building, they were in a trap. 4:50 p.m. The windows. With the doors blocked or burning, the focus shifted to the massive windows. The only remaining hope was the single, flimsy, exterior fire escape. A line of desperate workers crawled out onto the narrow metal structure. But this escape, installed cheaply and never properly maintained, was built for show, not for rescue. It bent, then groaned, and within moments, with too many people clinging to it, the rusted rivets sheared away. The entire ladder structure collapsed, peeling away from the building's facade and plunging the screaming women clinging to it 8 stories down onto the pavement below. 4:52 p.m. The choice. On the street below, New York City stood still. Fire bells clanged and horse-drawn engines rushed to the scene. Crowds gathered, staring up in horror at the 9th floor. They could see the black silhouettes of young women standing on the windowsills, framed by the inferno behind them. The firefighters arrived, but their ladders could only reach the 7th floor. The height of the skyscraper, a marvel of modern engineering, had become an insurmountable death sentence. The women on the 9th floor had two choices: burn or jump. Rosaria Giammona and Fanny Rosenfeld stood near the windows, united in their terror. They watched a group of workers, led by a young couple, embrace and then leap together, choosing a swift, devastating end over the agony of the flames. Witnesses on the street, including a young social worker named Frances Perkins, who would later become President Franklin D. Roosevelt's Secretary of Labor, watched in paralyzing silence. The sound of the falling bodies hitting the sidewalk was described by witnesses as a dull, heavy thud. 4:58 p.m. The silence. It was over in 18 minutes. By the time the fire department managed to control the blaze on the 9th floor, the room was a scorched, smoking graveyard. The bodies of the victims lay piled up at the foot of the locked Green Street door, where they had made their final, futile stand. Others were fused to their sewing machines, and others lay in broken heaps on the street below. 146 people, 39 on the street, 107 inside, died. They died because a door was locked, a ladder was weak, and profit was prioritized over human life. In those 18 minutes, the American public received a searing, undeniable lesson in the true cost of industrial prosperity. The beautiful shirtwaists, the engine of the American garment industry, were stained red with the blood of the workers. Chapter 4. The Morning and the Fury. Sunday, March 26, 1911, New York City. The morning after the fire, the corner of Washington Place and Green Street was no longer a workplace. It was a shrine of unimaginable grief. The street was cordoned off, but thousands of New Yorkers, mostly the relatives and neighbors of the victims, clustered behind the ropes. The air was cold, but the palpable heat came from the slow, agonizing process of identification. The bodies had been taken to a temporary morgue on Pier 26 on the East River. It was here that mothers, fathers, sisters, and fiancés walked through rows of plain pine coffins, looking for a familiar curve of the cheek, a distinct shade of hair, or a scrap of recognizable clothing. The task was horrific. Many of the bodies were unrecognizable due to the fall or the intense heat. Parents had to identify their children by the specific shoes they wore that day, or by a small scar, or even by a piece of jewelry that had survived the flames. The unclaimed dead. The trauma of the identification process was magnified by the grim reality of the city's population. Rosaria Giammona's mother, Catherine, found her daughter. But for 20 days the bodies of 7 young women remained unclaimed, a testament to the isolation and anonymity of the immigrant experience. They were buried in a single large vault, later marked by a plaque reading simply, 7 Unknown. These girls, who had come to America seeking identity and prosperity, died without a name. They became a powerful symbol of the disposable nature of the industrial worker. A scornful silence. While the city wept, The owners, Max Blank and Isaac Harris, were silent. They issued a brief, callous statement expressing regret, but immediately deflected blame. The media coverage was swift and brutal. Newspapers like the New York World and the New York Times ran massive front-page headlines. The narrative shifted quickly from a simple accident to an indictment of capitalism. The public learned the facts Fanny Rosenfeld and the others had known all along: the locked doors, the inadequate fire escape, the worthless fire hoses, the deliberate policy of prioritizing fabric inventory over human safety. The fury wasn't aimed at the fire itself, but at the men who had locked the door, the men who through criminal negligence had turned their factory into a crematorium. April 5th, 1911, the funeral of the unforgotten. Less than 2 weeks after the disaster, the labor movement turned grief into a weapon. The general funeral demonstration on April 5th was an event unlike New York had ever seen. A procession of silent, black-clad mourners, nearly 350,000 people strong, marched slowly down Fifth Avenue. They carried no flags and shouted no slogans. The only sound was the shuffle of feet and the occasional heart-rending sob. This was not a protest, it was a demand for acknowledgement. At the head of the procession marched the women of the ILGWI, including Clara Lemlich, her voice now hoarse, her spirit unbroken. Behind them came the coffins of the victims, and behind those 250,000 citizens. Factory workers, socialists, union members, society women from the uptown mansions, and average, appalled New Yorkers. Frances Perkins, the social worker who had watched the young women jump, marched in that procession. She later described the experience as a profound political awakening. It was the moment seared on my mind. We all started to walk a little straighter and stand a little taller, knowing that we could no longer be dismissed. This was the fire that lit the torch of American labor law. The message of the march was simple and devastating. The shirtwaist kings killed these girls. The demonstration successfully mobilized the political will of the city. The pressure became immense, and the wheels of justice, slow and imperfect as they were, began to turn. Max Blank and Isaac Harris were formally charged with manslaughter, not for locking the doors, but for causing the death of one specific victim, Margaret Schwartz, whose death could be directly traced to the locked exit. The fight for justice was about to move from the street to the courtroom.
Chapter 5. The Trial of the Shirtwaist Kings. New York City, December 1911. 9 months after the fire, the criminal trial of Max Blank and Isaac Harris, the owners of the Triangle Shirtwaist Company, finally began. The city was still raw with grief and outrage. This wasn't just a legal proceeding, it was a trial of the American industrial system. The prosecution, led by Assistant District Attorney Charles S. Bostwick, faced a monumental challenge. They had to prove that Blank and Harris had willfully and criminally caused the death of one specific worker, Margaret Schwartz, by locking the 9th floor door that led to the Green Street stairwell. Proving general negligence wouldn't be enough. They needed manslaughter. The defense was led by the legendary Max Steuer, one of the most brilliant and highest-paid criminal lawyers in the city. Steuer was cunning, meticulously prepared, and deeply cynical about the jury's emotions. The power of doubt. The prosecution presented its case through heartbreaking testimony. Survivors, mostly young immigrant women, recounted the hellish scene, the smoke, the heat, the fruitless struggle against the locked door. They pointed to the owners, testifying that they had personally seen them or their foreman turn the key to prevent pilfering and premature quitting. The defense attorney, Stewart, didn't bother to deny the tragedy. He focused on a single, powerful strategy: creating reasonable doubt. The key's location. Stewart argued that the key to the locked door was always readily available, typically kept on a hook near the exit. He suggested that in the panic, the workers either couldn't find it, or that the key had simply fallen out during the stampede. He implied that the workers themselves, in their hysterical state, were responsible for their failure to escape. The interpreters. Many of the witnesses spoke only Yiddish or Italian. Stewart exploited this, relentlessly questioning the translators and the witnesses about minor inconsistencies in their testimony, making the young, traumatized women appear confused or unreliable. He painted them as emotional, foreign, and prone to exaggeration. The foreman's testimony. Crucially, the defense called one of the foremen to the stand, who testified that the door was never locked during working hours, only sometimes after the final whistle. This created the exact measure of doubt Stewart needed. Stewart's performance was a masterful display of legal theatrics, appealing to the jurors' deep-seated prejudices against immigrants and organized labor. He was essentially arguing, "Don't believe these foreign girls who want to ruin two respectable, successful American businessmen." The verdict. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours. On December 27, 1911, the foreman read the verdict: not guilty. A collective gasp went through the courtroom. Outside, the news spread instantly, sparking a fresh wave of public fury. Blank and Harris walked free, having suffered no criminal punishment for the deaths of 146 people. Justice for profit. The injustice was staggering, but it wasn't the end of the legal saga. There was still the matter of the civil suits. The families of the victims filed dozens of wrongful death suits. To avoid prolonged, damaging litigation, Blank and Harris settled. The final settlement awarded to the families averaged $75 per victim. For contrast, Blank and Harris had collected approximately $400 per victim from their fire insurance policy. The message to New York was clear. The life of an immigrant factory worker was valued at less than a new sewing machine. However, the courtroom defeat, paradoxically, became the greatest victory for the working class. The acquittal didn't close the book on the Triangle Fire. It threw it wide open. The public was so outraged by the legal failure that it demanded and got political success. This failure of criminal justice energized a new class of progressive politicians and reformers, determined that no employer would ever again have the power to lock workers into a fiery trap. The fire had been a disaster. The trial made it a revolution in worker safety.
Chapter 6. The Birth of Modern Safety. New York City, 1912 to 1914. The acquittal of Max Blanc and Isaac Harris in 1911 did not extinguish the public fury, it merely redirected it. If the courts couldn't deliver justice, the legislature would. The Triangle Fire became the political catalyst for the greatest overhaul of safety and labor laws in American history. The rise of the reformers. The tragedy provided a powerful platform for a new generation of progressive politicians and social reformers. Francis Perkins, the young social worker who watched the horror unfold on the street, vowed that day to see to it that never again should such a tragedy occur. She threw herself into lobbying and reform, eventually becoming the most influential female politician of her time, and decades later, Franklin D. Roosevelt's Secretary of Labor, the first woman in a presidential cabinet. She essentially wrote much of the New Deal's labor legislation, always crediting the Triangle Fire as the source of her commitment. Alfred E. Smith and Robert F. Wagner, Sr. These two men, both rising stars in the New York Democratic Party and both sons of immigrants who understood the plight of the working class, were profoundly moved by the tragedy. They spearheaded the formation of the New York State Factory Investigating Commission, or FIC. The FIC was not content with inspecting a few factories. It was tasked with examining all working conditions in New York State. The Commission's investigators went everywhere. They descended into stifling bakeries, dark cigar-making shops, and hundreds of garment sweatshops. What they found was a systemic pattern of neglect, inadequate ventilation and sanitation, child labor, dangerous machinery with missing safety guards, widespread fire hazards, including locked doors and obstructed exits. The FIC's findings were published in a series of scathing reports that became required reading for lawmakers. The Commission's work was revolutionary because it shifted the burden of proof. It was no longer up to the worker to prove that a factory was dangerous. The state now had the responsibility to inspect and enforce safety. The legislative legacy. Between 1911 and 1914, the New York State Legislature passed 38 new laws directly addressing the dangers exposed by the Triangle Fire. These laws fundamentally changed the relationship between the state and the workplace. Fire safety codes. New regulations mandated specific requirements for sprinklers, fire extinguishers, and the composition of building materials. Exit requirements. Laws made it illegal to lock factory doors during working hours. All exits had to be marked and outward swinging doors became mandatory to prevent a stampede from jamming the escape route. Maximum occupancy. Factories were given strict limits on the number of workers allowed on any floor, preventing the overcrowding seen at the Triangle. Workplace sanitation and ventilation. New standards were set for air quality, lighting, and bathroom facilities, improving the daily lives of millions of workers. The New York laws became the gold standard for the rest of the nation. As other states copied them, the Triangle Fire's impact was codified into the American experience.